Hello, Class 2. I'm going to be answering your questions that you asked. You asked several excellent questions. So the first question that I'm going to be asking, student wants to know how to make electricity. All right, so the first thing you need to know is that everything around us is made of something we call matter. So, for example, the air is made of matter. Uh, Furniture is made of matter. People are made of matter. And really, everything that takes up space is made of matter. All right. And matter is made up of tiny little particles that are too small to see, and those are called atoms. So the picture on the top is actually a diagram of what an atom would look like. And these atoms combine to form all the stuff we find around the world. Now, atoms actually have smaller parts surrounding them called electrons, and they flow around something called a nucleus. So it might look something like this. Sometimes those electrons can start to flow through materials. So, for example, metals, that tends to happen instead of staying just around the nucleus. And when that happens, we get something called electricity. So here's an example of electrons flowing through a material. Okay, so now one way to make electricity would be to use a battery. And basically what's happening in a battery is that there's a chemical reaction taking place where the electrons go from one material to another material. And when that happens, since we have a flow of electrons, we have electricity. We see the electricity going through the wire, represented by that red box. On the bottom, this is called a generator, and basically what that does, it turns motion energy, and the motion could be from wind or water or burning fuel, converting it to motion, and then when it turns around, basically that's another way to generate electricity. You make the electrons flow because of magnets and wires and so forth. Okay, so speaking of magnets, another student wanted to know what magnets are made of. So actually, it may surprise you that actually all atoms have some sort of magnetic forces. Usually, they're very weak because they're pointing in all different directions that cancel each other out. But some materials can actually be made so that the magnetic forces are pointing all in the same direction. So some examples of that would be a material called ferrite, El Nico, and a couple of them are actually found in nature. One is called lodestone, the other is called magnetite. They're actually very similar. So those are actually naturally occurring materials which are able to have the magnetic force pointing in all one direction. That's basically what happens when we have a magnet. My next question that a student wanted to know, why can't we see air? So I thought that was an interesting question. Well, in order to answer that, I should explain that what we see as white light is actually more like a rainbow. And you could see this actually using something called a prism. It's a little triangular uh, shape which breaks the light into all seven colors of the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. So I should also explain what it means to see something in the first place. What does that even mean? So we were just talking about atoms, and I should also mention the reason we see anything is that sometimes this light bumps into some of those atoms. And when that happens, some of the colors I just mentioned get absorbed or soaked up by the atom, and others reflect or bounce off the atom. They scatter in all different directions. So depending on the combination of colors that reflect those atoms and get into our eyes and into our brain, an object might appear as red, green, purple, or any other color. Depends on the type of atom. So here's just an example of how that procedure works. We have the light, which shines, might hit an object. That light bounces off the object, gets in certain wavelengths of light, gets into our eye, sends a signal to our brain where all the thought takes place, and we see in our brain actually an image of the object that was reflected. All right, and my next question was about outer space. Do space people stay to live out there? So I thought that was an interesting question. Well, The longest an astronaut has stayed in space is about 437 days. That's a little over a year, so I guess that counts as living in space. There's some problems with living in space, though, that because you're weightless, it means meaning you float, you feel like there's no up and down. That's hard on an astronaut's body because it makes your bones weaker, it makes your muscles a lot weaker. And another problem is that there's nowhere to get new supplies of food or other things you need. Everything's so far away. So another rocket would need to be launched in order to get more supplies, which is very expensive. And as we get better at space travel, for example, we figure out how to simulate gravity in outer space, it becomes easier to get to outer space. People should be able to live more comfortably and for a longer time. The last question I'm going to answer is about plants and whether there are plants on other planets. So things like trees, cactuses, flowers. So far, we've only ever set foot on one other object rather other than the Earth. So here we see the Earth rising from the moon. And the moon has no air, very little water, so plants can't live there. We've sent probes to Mars, which seems to not have the right conditions for plant to grow either. So you see, Earth seems to be in just the right spot in our solar system for light. Other planets are either too far or too cold. If they're too far, they're too cold, or they're too close and too hot. So we can't be certain, but it's not likely that any of our solar system's planet can have plants growing on them. However, there are stars other than the sun in other solar systems, so they may have planets similar to planets on Earth. Astronomers, people who study outer space, are discovering new planets within the last few years. And maybe there's another planet where things like plants can grow, where it's not too cold or hot. There's enough water and an atmosphere with air that allow plants to grow. We just don't know. Thank you for your questions, Class 2.